The small neighborhood cafe smelled of fresh bread, warm coffee, and a hint of vanilla syrup. Every morning, the smell mixed with the chatter of early risers and the soft clinking of cups on saucers, creating a gentle rhythm that felt like the heart of the neighborhood. The young woman working behind the counter wiped a small table near the window and glanced outside. The morning sunlight touched the pavement, highlighting tiny cracks and footprints left by hurried pedestrians. It was another ordinary morning, but ordinary days sometimes held unexpected surprises. She moved with practiced ease, greeting customers with a smile, taking orders, and carefully preparing steaming cups of coffee. She had been working at the cafe for almost 2 years, balancing her shifts with classes and part-time tutoring. Life was not always easy, but she had grown used to the rhythm of it. Some days were quiet, some days chaotic, and most days passed with the comfort of familiarity. He was a man who came in almost every morning, around the same time, and sat at the same corner table. His hair was white, neatly combed, and his eyes had a softness that suggested years of wisdom and stories untold. He never demanded attention or made loud conversation. Instead, he quietly ordered a simple coffee, usually black, and sat down as if he were visiting an old friend rather than a bustling cafe. Today, as she noticed him struggling to count coins in his worn wallet, she felt a gentle tug of empathy. The man counted carefully, laying coins on the counter, his hands slightly trembling with age. He looked at her, smiled apologetically, and murmured something about being a few cents short. Without thinking much, she picked up the small change he was missing and placed it in the till. He looked at her with surprise, eyes widening slightly, before giving her a soft, grateful nod. She smiled back, brushing it off as just another morning gesture. Helping people had become a habit for her, not something she thought about deeply every time. He sat down in his usual spot, sipping his coffee slowly, savoring it like it was more than just a drink. She went back to taking orders and serving drinks, but she couldn't help stealing glances at him every now and then. There was a quiet dignity about him, something that set him apart from the regular crowd. She noticed the way he folded his hands on the table, the way he seemed to watch the world around him with gentle curiosity, and she wondered about the life he had lived. As the morning passed, the cafe filled with more customers. A group of college students came in, laughing loudly, taking selfies and chatting about their plans for the day. The elderly man remained in his corner untouched by the noise, immersed in his thoughts and the warmth of his coffee. The young woman felt a strange sense of calm watching him, as if his presence brought a quiet balance to the chaos around. Later, a young couple came in, ordering pastries and cappuccinos. She served them with the same bright smile she offered to everyone, but her mind kept wandering back to the elderly man. He seemed almost invisible to the others, but she had begun to notice details that others might miss. The careful way he handled his cup, the slight hesitation before he took a sip, the way his eyes softened when he saw children passing by outside. He carried a gentle kindness in his demeanor, something she respected silently. The morning continued, and the man finished his coffee, leaving a small tip before standing up to leave. He paused by the counter, looked at her, and said a simple thank you. There was a warmth in his voice, quiet yet sincere. She nodded, returning the gesture, and he walked out the door, disappearing into the sunlight and the morning hustle. She watched him go, feeling a strange sense of connection, even though they barely exchanged words. The rest of the day followed its usual rhythm, with customers coming and going, orders being filled, and the aroma of coffee filling the air. Yet something lingered in her mind, the thought of the elderly man and the small interaction that had happened that morning. She realized that kindness didn't always need grand gestures. Sometimes it was in the smallest actions, like covering a few cents for someone who needed it. Days turned into weeks, and the routine continued. The elderly man returned almost every morning, always sitting in his corner, always ordering his simple coffee. The young woman continued her small acts of kindness, paying for his coffee occasionally when he was a few coins short. It became something she did almost automatically, without thinking, and yet it brought her a quiet sense of fulfillment. She had no idea who he really was or what his life had been like, and she didn't need to. In those small moments, they shared a silent understanding that needed no words. She began to notice other details about him over time, the way he would sometimes leave a small sketch or a note on the table, as if he were sharing a piece of his thoughts with the world. She once found a tiny drawing of a tree with the words, "Patience brings beauty," scribbled underneath. Another time, there was a short note that read, "Kindness matters more than wealth." She kept these little pieces, feeling a growing respect for the quiet wisdom he carried. The young woman's life outside the cafe was full of its own challenges. She balanced schoolwork, family responsibilities, and part-time shifts, often feeling exhausted but determined. The small interactions with the elderly man became a highlight in her routine, moments that reminded her of the goodness in people and the simplicity of connection. She began to think about how little acts, even those unnoticed by most, could make a difference in someone's day. It wasn't about recognition or reward. It was about human connection. One morning, she found him looking particularly thoughtful, staring out the window with his coffee untouched. She approached quietly, asking if everything was all right. He smiled gently and shook his head, saying he was just lost in thought. They spoke briefly about the weather, the neighborhood, and the small joys in life. She noticed the calmness in his voice, a patience that seemed almost timeless. For her, those moments were lessons in humility and understanding, teaching her to slow down and appreciate the little things. The cafe continued to be a hub of life, children laughing, friends catching up, strangers passing through. But for her, the corner table and the elderly man had become a place of quiet reflection. She never imagined that a simple act of paying for a coffee could mark the beginning of something far more significant, a connection that would change the course of her life in ways she couldn't yet see. Each morning as she cleaned the tables, brewed the coffee, and served the customers, she carried a sense of purpose, a reminder that kindness, even in its smallest form, mattered. And so the mornings passed, each filled with the ordinary yet touched by the extraordinary. A young woman offering small gestures of care, an elderly man carrying a quiet presence that spoke volumes, and the gentle rhythm of a cafe that held stories untold, waiting to unfold in their own time. The following week brought more of the same quiet mornings, yet something about the routine felt slightly different to the young woman. She had begun to notice more about the elderly man, the small nuances in his expressions, the way he would sometimes tap his fingers on the table in rhythm with some unheard tune, and the way his eyes would wander to the sunlight hitting the corner of the cafe. She started to look forward to seeing him, not because he was wealthy or famous, she didn't even know that, but because he seemed to carry a presence that made the morning feel calm and full of quiet understanding. It was a Wednesday morning when it all subtly shifted. The cafe was buzzing with the usual crowd. Students huddled over laptops, mothers tried to calm fussy toddlers, and the barista who worked the afternoon shift chatted with regulars while refilling coffee cups. The young woman moved quickly behind the counter, preparing drinks and taking orders with the kind of practiced efficiency that came after months of routine. She noticed the elderly man entering the cafe and her heart lifted as it always did. He moved slowly but deliberately, greeting the barista who nodded in recognition before he settled into his corner. This morning, however, he had a notebook tucked under his arm. As he ordered his usual coffee, he placed the notebook on the table and opened it gently. The young woman paused for a moment, curious but careful not to intrude. She wondered what he wrote in that notebook, imagining sketches, poems, or maybe even lists of memories he wanted to preserve. The idea fascinated her. She poured his coffee, careful not to spill, and set it on the table with a small smile. He looked up, thanked her softly, and gestured toward the notebook. Over the next few weeks, she began noticing that the old man sometimes left short notes or small sketches on the table. Once there was a tiny drawing of a bird in flight, and beneath it were the words, "Freedom is in small moments." Another day, she found a short poem about kindness and patience. She began to read them during breaks, feeling a sense of warmth and inspiration. She didn't know why he chose to share these pieces of his thoughts with her, but it became a small ritual that brightened her days. Her colleagues started noticing her growing attention toward the elderly man. They whispered occasionally, asking if she knew who he was, but she shook her head. She didn't care about rumors or gossip. To her, he was just a man who had a quiet presence, and she found comfort in that. One colleague joked that he was probably a retired teacher, or a quiet millionaire who liked his coffee without fanfare. She laughed softly but didn't press further, not wanting to speculate. The point of their interactions wasn't about status. It was about shared humanity and small gestures of kindness. One slow morning, she noticed the elderly man staring at a young mother trying to calm her baby. His eyes were gentle, almost tender, as he observed the small struggle. He made a soft, reassuring gesture with his hand, as if silently telling the mother it was okay, that patience mattered, that the chaos would pass. The young woman watched this silently from behind the counter, struck by the depth of his empathy. She realized he carried a quiet wisdom that could not be taught, a kind of awareness that made him seem larger than life without needing to assert it. She also began to notice his interactions with others who entered the cafe. He nodded politely to regulars, smiled softly at passers-by, and never spoke in a way that drew unnecessary attention. Yet somehow he seemed to leave an imprint on everyone who crossed his path. She saw people pause slightly longer, look up with a smile, or soften in their demeanor after encountering him. It amazed her how someone so unassuming could quietly influence the atmosphere around them. One morning, the cafe was unusually crowded. The line stretched past the counter, and the aroma of coffee was thick in the air. The young woman moved quickly, taking orders and preparing drinks, her hands flying over the espresso machine with practiced precision. Through the crowd, she noticed the elderly man struggling slightly to maneuver through the narrow aisle. She stepped aside, offering him a gentle hand to guide him toward his usual seat. He thanked her with a nod, his eyes meeting hers for a brief moment, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. Over the next few days, their small gestures of care and acknowledgement deepened into a quiet understanding. He would ask how her studies were going, inquiring with gentle interest about her life beyond the cafe. She shared small details with him, her worries about balancing work and school, her dreams for the future, and her hopes for a better life. He listened patiently, never interrupting, and occasionally offered simple advice, always phrased in a way that felt like a suggestion rather than a lecture. It was remarkable, she thought, how someone she barely knew could provide such clarity without ever imposing. Her friends outside the cafe started noticing a subtle change in her demeanor. She seemed calmer, more confident, and yet humbler. She laughed more freely and carried herself with a sense of quiet assurance. She never mentioned the elderly man in detail, only that some small interactions at work had inspired her in ways she couldn't explain. She kept his presence in her life like a quiet secret, a source of encouragement that required no recognition. One rainy morning, she found him shivering slightly as he entered the cafe, his coat thin against the chill. She quickly set about preparing his coffee, offering an extra blanket from the chair in the corner. He smiled softly, grateful, and accepted the gesture. As she handed him the coffee, she noticed his hands trembling slightly from the cold. Without thinking, she offered a few words of reassurance, telling him to take care and that the weather would clear soon. He nodded, a small smile spreading across his face, and in that moment she realized the impact of small kindnesses. Weeks passed, and their silent friendship grew. The young woman found herself anticipating his presence, not out of obligation, but out of genuine interest in his well-being. She discovered that in their short conversations, he had a wealth of knowledge about the world, yet he never flaunted it. Instead, he shared insights subtly, teaching lessons about patience, empathy, and the quiet power of generosity. She began to see her own life in a new light, understanding that the smallest gestures could carry profound meaning. One morning, as the cafe prepared for the usual rush, he spoke for the first time about something deeper. He asked her what motivated her to help people without expecting anything in return. She paused, surprised by the question, and simply replied that it felt right, that she couldn't imagine not helping when someone needed it. He nodded thoughtfully, his eyes reflecting a depth she had not seen before, as if he recognized something rare in her character. She didn't know then that he had noticed her kindness from the very first day she had covered the few missing cents for his coffee. The young woman continued her work, serving drinks, cleaning tables, and offering small acts of care to anyone who entered the cafe. She was unaware that her simple gestures were quietly changing the way the elderly man viewed the world and those around him. To him, she represented a purity of heart that was increasingly rare, someone whose actions spoke louder than words, someone who embodied the values he had long cherished but rarely seen in others. The rhythm of the cafe, the conversations, the laughter, and the quiet moments of reflection all blended together, creating a space where human connection thrived. For the young woman, the elderly man became a symbol of wisdom and calm, someone whose presence encouraged her to be her best self. She continued her daily routine with renewed purpose, unaware that the bond forming between them would eventually lead to life-changing revelations. Small gestures, quiet observations, and shared moments of understanding were weaving a story neither of them could have anticipated, and yet the threads were coming together with gentle inevitability. By the time the week drew to a close, the young woman realized that the elderly man had become more than just a customer or a quiet presence in the cafe. He had become a mentor in subtle ways, a source of inspiration, and a reminder that kindness, patience, and quiet understanding were values worth cultivating. She never guessed at his true wealth, his past achievements, or the influence he wielded in the world. For her, he was simply a man who shared small moments of wisdom, who listened without judgment, and who quietly reinforced the idea that even the smallest acts of kindness mattered in ways that could ripple far beyond the immediate moment. And so, the days continued, each morning unfolding with the comforting rhythm of coffee, conversation, and subtle lessons in humanity. The young woman continued to serve with care, to offer kindness without expectation, and to absorb the quiet wisdom the elderly man shared. Their connection deepened, not through grand gestures or dramatic events, but through the steady accumulation of small, meaningful moments that built trust, respect, and a quiet sense of wonder at the goodness that could exist between two people who barely knew each other, yet shared something profoundly human. The mornings at the cafe had settled into a rhythm, but for the young woman they were far from ordinary. Each day brought small surprises and quiet lessons that she carried with her, long after her shift ended. She began to realize that her connection with the elderly man was deeper than she had first imagined. It was not just a customer relationship. It had grown into something she could not quite put into words, a bond built on shared humanity and simple kindness. One particular morning, the cafe was quieter than usual, with only a handful of regulars scattered at tables. The young woman was wiping down counters when she noticed the elderly man struggling slightly with the door, a small umbrella barely shielding him from a drizzle that had started outside. She quickly went to help, holding the door and guiding him toward his usual corner seat. He looked up at her, a faint smile playing on his lips, and thanked her softly. That small exchange carried a weight she couldn't explain, a recognition that something unspoken was growing between them. As he settled with his coffee, he opened his notebook and she caught a glimpse of a short note written in neat handwriting. Curious but respectful, she didn't look too closely, sensing that it was private. Over time, she had learned to respect the small boundaries that existed between them, understanding that their connection didn't require intrusion. She placed a fresh cup of water on the table and returned to her tasks, her thoughts lingering on the man and the quiet dignity he carried. The elderly man began to speak more often during these slow mornings. He asked her about her studies, about her family, and her dreams for the future. She answered candidly, sharing the pressures of balancing work and school, her aspirations for a stable life, and the small victories that made her days brighter. He listened with patience, offering gentle advice and encouragement, never judging, never interrupting. She found herself looking forward to these conversations more than she expected. They were moments of connection, of understanding, of subtle guidance that felt almost magical in their simplicity. One day, as she prepared a sandwich for a customer, she overheard the elderly man speaking softly to another regular. His words were kind and thoughtful, his tone full of genuine interest. She realized then that he carried this same quiet respect for everyone he encountered. It wasn't selective or performative. It was simply who he was. She began to pay closer attention, noticing the way he made small gestures, offering a smile to a harried parent, letting someone go ahead in line, speaking gently to the shy child who wandered in with her mother. Each small action was a lesson, a subtle example of how kindness could ripple outward in ways that touched people's lives without them even realizing it. The young woman found herself reflecting on her own actions in the cafe. She realized that she too had the power to make small differences, to ease someone's morning, to offer a moment of warmth in a day that might otherwise feel cold or challenging. Her confidence grew quietly, rooted not in pride but in the simple awareness that her efforts mattered. She began noticing the little things she could do, making eye contact with a nervous customer, offering extra napkins without being asked, remembering regulars' favorite drinks. Each gesture was small, yet she felt their significance more deeply than ever before. One morning, she noticed the elderly man writing more than usual in his notebook. He scribbled quickly, pausing to sip his coffee, then continuing. Curiosity tugged at her, but she reminded herself that his notebook was his private space. Instead, she focused on her work, serving customers with care and attention, all the while sensing his presence as a quiet anchor in the room. The notebook remained closed as he left that day, and she found herself wondering what thoughts he had chosen to capture, what reflections or memories he held dear. The young woman's life outside the cafe continued as usual, full of responsibilities and small struggles. She managed her classes, her part-time tutoring, and household chores with determination. Yet the mornings at the cafe became a source of strength, a reminder that simple acts of connection and kindness were meaningful. She carried lessons from the elderly man into her interactions outside, treating people with more patience, listening more deeply, and approaching challenges with a calmness she had not felt before. It was as if his quiet wisdom had seeped into her, shaping her perspective in subtle but profound ways. Over time, the elderly man shared small pieces of his past with her, not as grand stories or tales of adventure, but as gentle reflections on life. He spoke of places he had traveled, people he had met, and the lessons he had learned. She listened intently, fascinated by the richness of his experiences and the humility with which he recounted them. There was no need for extravagance or show. His stories were compelling simply because they were real, grounded in the human experience and shared with honesty. She began to notice patterns in his visits. Some mornings he seemed contemplative, staring out the window for long stretches, while on other days, he engaged more actively with the small moments around him. The laughter of children, the smell of fresh bread, the chatter of friends catching up. She realized that he found beauty and meaning in the ordinary, a perspective that resonated deeply with her. She began to adopt a similar outlook, noticing details she had once overlooked. The way sunlight hit the corner table, the subtle smile of a customer lost in thought, the comforting aroma of freshly baked pastries. One morning, during a particularly slow moment, the elderly man gestured for her to sit for a few minutes. She hesitated, surprised but obliged, settling across from him. He asked her about her dreams in greater detail, encouraging her to speak openly. She shared her aspirations for a stable career, the hope of helping her family, and the desire to make a positive impact on the people around her. He listened carefully, nodding thoughtfully, and offered advice that was simple yet profound, encouraging her to trust her instincts, to remain kind even when it was difficult, and to value her own worth. The young woman left the cafe that day feeling a sense of clarity she had never experienced before. The conversation had been brief, yet it left a lasting impression. She understood that true wisdom was often quiet, gentle, and patient. It did not demand attention or recognition. It simply existed and influenced those willing to observe and learn. The elderly man's presence had become a guiding force in her life, shaping her perspective and inspiring her actions in ways she could not fully articulate. Days turned into weeks, and their interactions grew more meaningful. The young woman found herself sharing small moments of her life with him, the triumphs, the frustrations, and even the small joys she encountered daily. He responded with empathy and encouragement, never judgment, always understanding. It was a rare and precious connection, one built on mutual respect, kindness, and the shared recognition of humanity. One particularly quiet morning, the elderly man asked her a question that caught her off guard. He inquired why she treated strangers with such genuine care, why she went out of her way to help without expecting anything in return. She paused, considering her answer carefully, and simply said that it felt right, that she could not imagine ignoring someone who needed help. He smiled, a warmth in his eyes that made her feel understood on a deep level. For the first time, she sensed that he had noticed her in ways she had not realized, that her small acts of kindness had left an impression far beyond what she had intended. The young woman continued her routine with renewed purpose, aware that her small gestures mattered. She served drinks with care, greeted customers warmly, and offered assistance without hesitation. She realized that the impact of kindness was not measured by grand achievements, but by the quiet ways it could touch lives, inspire others, and foster connections. Each day at the cafe became more than a job. It became a space for learning, growth, and the cultivation of empathy. The elderly man continued to visit regularly, his quiet presence a source of stability and inspiration. He shared his thoughts through subtle words, small notes, and gentle conversations. She observed the effect he had on others as well, noticing the subtle changes in the cafe's atmosphere when he was present. Customers seemed calmer, friendlier, and more appreciative of the simple joys around them. She realized that his influence extended beyond their interactions, touching everyone who entered the space in small but meaningful ways. By the time the month drew to a close, the young woman understood that their connection had grown into something profound, built on shared moments, empathy, and the recognition of each other's humanity. She continued to serve with care, offering kindness without expectation and absorbing the quiet lessons he imparted. She did not yet know the full story of the elderly man's life or the influence he wielded in the world, but she felt the depth of his wisdom and the significance of their bond. The mornings at the cafe remained filled with the familiar sounds of coffee brewing, conversation and laughter, but for the young woman, they were now imbued with meaning. Each interaction, each gesture of care, and each moment of reflection contributed to a growing understanding of life, kindness, and the power of small actions. The elderly man had become a mentor, a source of inspiration and a silent guide, shaping her character in ways she would carry forward indefinitely. And so, the days continued, filled with the quiet rhythm of the cafe, the shared moments of connection, and the growing sense of purpose that came from understanding that even the simplest acts of kindness could have far-reaching effects. The young woman's life was changing in subtle, profound ways, guided by the gentle influence of someone who had touched her life without demanding anything in return. The story of their bond, built on trust, empathy, and shared humanity, was unfolding quietly, preparing for moments of revelation and transformation that neither of them could yet foresee. The mornings at the cafe had settled into a comforting rhythm, but the young woman began to notice subtle changes in the atmosphere. She had become accustomed to the quiet presence of the elderly man, but she also started seeing how his influence gently spread through the cafe. Customers seemed more patient, more considerate, and sometimes even a little kinder, as if the calm and dignity he carried quietly touched everyone around him. She felt a growing sense of gratitude, both for his presence and for the lessons she was learning through their interactions. One morning, the cafe was busier than usual. The line stretched past the counter, and the smell of coffee mixed with freshly baked pastries filled every corner. She moved swiftly, taking orders and serving drinks, her hands and mind working in perfect coordination. In the midst of the rush, she noticed the elderly man standing quietly near the door, seemingly watching the scene unfold. She paused for a brief moment, catching his eye, and he gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, but it carried a sense of reassurance and understanding. She felt a quiet connection in that single gesture, a reminder that sometimes presence alone could be comforting and grounding. As the day progressed, she observed him leaving small notes for the staff and regulars, little reminders of kindness, patience, and thoughtfulness. One note read, "A smile can brighten even the cloudiest day," and another said, "Help without expecting. Love without conditions." She found herself reading these notes during brief breaks, feeling inspired and uplifted. His messages were simple, yet they carried a weight and depth that made her reflect on her own actions and choices. She realized that these small gestures could ripple far beyond what one could imagine, touching lives in subtle but meaningful ways. A week later, the cafe hosted a small community event. The elderly man arrived early as always and took his seat in the familiar corner. She noticed that people seemed drawn to him, quietly gravitating toward his calm demeanor and warm presence. He spoke with neighbors and regulars in a gentle, respectful manner, asking about their families and their days. She observed the effect he had on everyone, the way conversations seemed to flow more easily, the smiles that lingered longer, and the warmth that filled the room. It became clear to her that he was more than a quiet presence. He was a guiding force in the lives of those around him, offering kindness and wisdom without demanding attention or recognition. During a brief lull in the event, he called her over to his table. She approached cautiously, unsure what he wanted to discuss. He smiled and asked her to sit, insisting that she take a moment to breathe and enjoy the small celebration of community. She complied, sitting across from him, feeling a sense of calm wash over her. He spoke softly, asking about her dreams, her challenges, and the steps she was taking to build the life she wanted. She shared her thoughts openly, feeling a sense of trust and safety in his presence. His words were gentle and encouraging, offering insight without pressure or expectation. As the conversation continued, she realized that he had been observing her quietly for some time, noting her small acts of kindness, her attentiveness to others, and the genuine care she showed in her work and interactions. He praised her in a way that felt sincere and heartfelt, highlighting the impact of her actions even when she thought they went unnoticed. She felt a mix of surprise, humility, and deep gratitude, recognizing that her everyday gestures had resonated far beyond her immediate awareness. Over the next few days, the young woman noticed subtle changes in her own life. She felt more confident in her decisions, more patient in difficult situations, and more intentional in her interactions with others. She began to see the effects of kindness as a living force, one that could shape her environment and influence the people around her. Her perspective shifted, and she started approaching challenges with a sense of calm assurance, inspired by the quiet example set by the elderly man. One afternoon, during a slow period in the cafe, he asked her to accompany him to a small meeting nearby. Curious but trusting, she agreed. They walked together through the quiet streets, talking about life, values, and the importance of integrity. When they arrived, she realized that he was attending a philanthropic gathering, one where the focus was on giving back to the community and supporting causes that improved the lives of others. She listened intently as he spoke with other attendees, impressed by the respect and admiration he commanded without ever raising his voice or seeking the spotlight. It was during this gathering that she first began to sense the truth about his identity. People approached him with deference and gratitude, thanking him for his generosity and contributions. She saw the genuine respect in their eyes, and something clicked in her mind. The realization began to dawn slowly but steadily. The man she had come to know as quiet, kind, and unassuming was someone extraordinary in the world beyond the cafe. Yet, despite his achievements and influence, he remained humble, approachable, and attentive to those around him. After the event, they walked back to the cafe in silence, the afternoon sunlight casting long shadows along the streets. She tried to piece together what she had witnessed, but words failed her. The elderly man seemed to sense her thoughts and offered a gentle smile, as if reassuring her that understanding would come in time. She realized then that her perception of him had changed, not because of wealth or status, but because she had seen the way he treated others, with genuine kindness, humility, and respect. Back at the cafe, she resumed her work, but her mind was alive with reflection. She replayed the events of the day, thinking about the contrast between the public recognition he received and the quiet, everyday interactions they had shared. She understood that true greatness was not measured by accolades or wealth, but by the ability to touch lives positively and authentically. Her admiration for him deepened, not for what he had achieved in the world, but for the character he had displayed consistently in the simplest of acts. Over the following days, news began to circulate quietly among the staff and regulars. The elderly man had made significant contributions to the community, supporting education, healthcare, and local initiatives. People began to speak of his philanthropy with reverence, and yet he continued to visit the cafe daily, sitting quietly in his corner, sipping coffee, and leaving small notes of encouragement. She marveled at the contrast between his public impact and his personal humility. He remained the same gentle, thoughtful presence she had always known, unaffected by recognition or acclaim. One morning, she noticed that he had left a special note for her on the corner of his usual table. She picked it up, feeling a sense of anticipation mixed with curiosity. The note acknowledged her consistent kindness, her genuine care for others, and the impact she had unknowingly made. It expressed gratitude for the way she treated people with compassion and integrity, highlighting how rare and valuable such qualities were. She read the note carefully, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and humility. She realized then that her small everyday actions had resonated with someone who truly understood their significance. From that day on, their interactions carried a new depth. She approached her work with a renewed sense of purpose, inspired by the knowledge that kindness mattered deeply, even in ways she could not fully see. She continued to serve customers with attention and care, to offer support without expectation, and to recognize the quiet moments that shaped people's days. The elderly man remained a steady presence, offering guidance and encouragement, always mindful of the lessons embedded in simple actions. As the month drew to a close, she reflected on the transformation in her own perspective. The cafe, once just a place of work, had become a space of learning, growth, and connection. She understood now that true influence came not from power or wealth, but from the consistent practice of empathy, kindness, and thoughtful attention. She had witnessed it in the elderly man, and she had experienced it in the subtle ways her own actions could touch others. The realization was humbling, inspiring, and profoundly motivating. The revelation of the elderly man's true identity did not diminish her respect for him. Rather, it deepened it. She admired the balance he maintained between public influence and personal humility, and she recognized that the qualities she valued most, kindness, patience, and empathy, were not dependent on status or recognition. She felt fortunate to have shared in small moments with someone who embodied these values so consistently and authentically. In the days that followed, she continued to serve with care, guided by the lessons she had absorbed from him. She noticed subtle shifts in the cafe's atmosphere. More smiles, more gratitude, more warmth. Customers responded to her attentiveness, and she felt the satisfaction of knowing that even small gestures could create meaningful connections. She carried the memory of the elderly man's quiet guidance with her, understanding that the true measure of influence was not what one achieved in the world, but how one treated those around them. The mornings remained filled with the comforting sounds of coffee brewing, conversation, and gentle laughter. But for her, they were now imbued with purpose and meaning. She continued to learn, to grow, and to witness the impact of kindness in action. Each day was a reminder that small acts mattered, that empathy could change lives, and that genuine care could leave lasting impressions. The elderly man's presence was no longer just a quiet comfort. It was a profound example of how integrity and humanity could shape the world, one simple interaction at a time. And so the story continued to unfold, with each morning offering new opportunities for connection, learning, and reflection. The young woman carried forward the lessons she had absorbed, guided by the gentle example of someone who had changed her perspective through simple acts of kindness and thoughtful attention. The cafe remained a place of warmth and community, a stage for quiet transformation and a spa. The young woman woke up the next morning with a sense of quiet excitement. The events of the previous weeks had shifted something inside her. She had come to understand the depth of the elderly man's wisdom, the subtle power of kindness, and the value of small gestures that could ripple far beyond what one could see. Today, she felt ready to embrace that understanding in ways that could truly change her life. At the cafe, the usual morning hum of activity greeted her. She moved with ease and confidence, taking orders, preparing drinks, and making small talk with regulars. Yet her mind was focused, reflecting on the lessons she had learned. Each smile, each polite exchange, each moment of patience with customers was now infused with intention. She had realized that her daily work, though seemingly ordinary, carried the potential for extraordinary impact. The elderly man arrived shortly after, settling into his usual corner, his notebook tucked under his arm. She greeted him warmly, and he returned her smile with a knowing nod. In that gesture, she sensed acknowledgement, a silent confirmation that her growth had been noticed. As the morning progressed, she noticed subtle changes in her interactions with customers. People responded to her attentiveness, returning smiles and showing small acts of kindness in response. She realized that influence could be contagious. The atmosphere of the cafe felt warmer, more inviting, and more connected. She began to see the potential for her own actions to create change beyond the immediate moment. Every cup of coffee, every word of encouragement, and every small gesture of care contributed to an environment of positivity and community. The elderly man caught her attention and motioned for her to come over during a brief lull. She approached, curious about what he wanted to discuss. He placed a hand on the notebook and gestured for her to sit. As she did, he began to speak, not about wealth or status, but about values, purpose, and the quiet power of integrity. He shared stories from his own life, illustrating moments when small acts of kindness had created profound outcomes. She listened intently, absorbing each word, recognizing the timeless truth in his reflections. Over the next few weeks, their conversations deepened. He asked about her goals, her challenges, and the obstacles she faced. She shared openly, speaking of her hopes to continue her education, support her family, and make a positive impact in her community. He listened without judgment, offering advice that was gentle, practical, and encouraging. His mentorship was subtle yet transformative, guiding her to see her own potential and the meaningful effects of her actions. She began to understand that success was not measured solely by personal achievement, but also by the positive influence one could have on others. One afternoon, he invited her to accompany him to a local initiative supporting education for underprivileged children. She was initially hesitant, but his calm reassurance encouraged her to participate. When they arrived, she witnessed the tangible impact of his generosity. Classrooms were bright with color, supplies were abundant, and the children's laughter filled the air. She saw teachers supported, students empowered, and a community uplifted. Observing his work in this context brought the lessons she had been learning to life, illustrating how consistent kindness and thoughtful action could create lasting change. After returning to the cafe, she reflected on the experience. She realized that her own life could be influenced in similar ways, not necessarily through wealth, but through the consistent practice of empathy, kindness, and intentional action. She felt motivated to apply these principles more broadly, reaching beyond the cafe and her immediate surroundings. The elderly man had become more than a mentor. He was a living example of how character, humility, and compassion could shape both personal and community life. In the following days, she began to notice new opportunities arising. People in her community recognized her dedication and the care she showed in her work. Invitations to participate in local volunteer efforts, mentorship programs, and educational initiatives started to appear. She found herself helping organize small events, supporting students and lending a hand wherever it was needed. The skills she had honed at the cafe, patience, attentiveness, and thoughtful interaction, proved invaluable in these new roles. She understood now that the foundations of meaningful influence were laid in everyday acts and consistent character. The elderly man continued to visit the cafe, observing her progress with quiet pride. One morning, he handed her a small envelope with a simple note inside. It read, "Your heart has already begun to shape the world. Continue to act with care, and the ripple will extend further than you can imagine." She read the note several times, feeling a mixture of humility and determination. It was a turning point, a moment when she fully realized that her small, everyday acts of kindness had not gone unnoticed, and that she had the power to create broader impact. With renewed purpose, she approached her work and interactions with heightened awareness. She greeted customers with warmth, offered help proactively, and sought to understand the challenges others faced. Each encounter became an opportunity to practice the lessons she had absorbed. She noticed that people responded with gratitude, warmth, and sometimes even gestures of kindness in return. The cafe became more than a place to serve coffee. It became a hub of community, connection, and mutual respect. As her confidence grew, she began to think about her long-term goals. Inspired by the elderly man's guidance and the impact she had begun to witness, she decided to pursue further education in community development. She wanted to continue supporting initiatives that uplifted people, especially those who lacked resources or opportunities. She envisioned a future where her actions, guided by empathy and integrity, could create meaningful change on a larger scale. The lessons from the cafe, the elderly man, and her own experiences had given her both clarity and courage. The elderly man noticed her growing resolve and encouraged her to take initiative, reminding her that true change often began with small, intentional steps. He shared practical advice on leadership, decision-making, and maintaining balance while pursuing goals. She found his guidance invaluable, appreciating the way he combined wisdom with humility. She realized that mentorship could take many forms, and that the most profound guidance often came from observing character in action rather than merely receiving instructions. Months passed, and the young woman continued to grow in both confidence and skill. Her efforts in the cafe, combined with her involvement in community initiatives, began to attract recognition. People acknowledged her dedication, her thoughtfulness, and the tangible difference she was making. Yet she remained grounded, understanding that her work was not about accolades but about meaningful impact. She carried the lessons of kindness, empathy, and consistency into everything she did, aware that her influence could extend far beyond what she could see. One day, the elderly man arrived at the cafe, his presence as calm and dignified as ever. He gestured for her to sit, and they shared a long conversation reflecting on the journey they had experienced together. She spoke about the ways her life had changed, the opportunities she had pursued, and the satisfaction she had found in helping others. He listened, nodding with a quiet smile, and acknowledged her growth, reinforcing that the values she embodied were rare and precious. In that moment, she felt a profound sense of completion, knowing that her journey of transformation had been nurtured by both guidance and personal initiative. The young woman continued to integrate the principles she had learned into her life. She applied them in her studies, her work, and her community involvement. She became a mentor herself, sharing the lessons of empathy, kindness, and intentional action with others who were seeking guidance. Her life had expanded in ways she had never anticipated, rooted in the small acts of care and understanding that had first defined her mornings at the cafe. Through it all, the elderly man remained a steady presence, not as a figure of authority or wealth, but as a living example of the quiet, transformative power of integrity, compassion, and consistent character. His influence was evident in the young woman's growth, the improved atmosphere of the cafe, and the broader impact she began to make in her community. She realized that true greatness was not defined by recognition or material wealth, but by the ability to inspire, guide, and uplift others through everyday actions.